Welcome to our latest In Conversation with event. Welcome to all of those of you who have stayed up, sipping your cocoa late into this evening in order to be able to join us. Our guests this evening, however, have not yet even had their tea because they're joining us from the United States, and they are Steve Nadler and Larry Shapiro, the authors of this excellent new book, When Bad Thinking Happens to Good People, How Philosophy Can Save Us From Ourselves, the most humanist of books that I've read in quite some time. So I'm sure that if you haven't already, you'll be ordering your copy online before the end of this session, if you haven't already read it, which many of you, of course, may have done so. I'll introduce our speakers before we get started. And then when I've done so, I'll invite them to talk a little bit about the themes of the book, maybe ask them a couple of questions myself. But the most important thing, of course, is that you should ask your questions this evening. That's what makes these sessions go with a bang. And you can do that by typing your questions into the Q&A box where we will see them and they can be answered. So we're joined this evening by Steve Nadler. Steve Nadler is the William H. Hay II Professor of Philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he's the Director of the Institute for Research in the Humanities. And his books include Think Least of Death, Spinoza on How to Live and How to Die, one of our favourites, Spinoza at Humanists UK, and in fact, probably in all humanist organisations. And also the author with Ben Nadler of Heretics, The Wondrous and Dangerous Beginnings of Modern Philosophy, which sounds also like a stonking good read. We're also joined by his co-author, Larry Shapiro, who's the Berent Professor of Philosophy also at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And his books include The Miracle Myth, Why Belief in the Resurrection and the Supernatural is Unjustified, and Embodied Cognition. So you'll see that our guest this evening's back catalogue is just as relevant and interesting to us all as their present work, but it's the present work that we will major on this evening. Welcome to both.
Thanks for having us, Andrew.
Hello. So I think you would assume that it was pretty obvious why a work like this was timely and seemed probably even more timely at the precise moment of its publication. But maybe you'd like to say a little bit about what you saw as the main stimulus to putting pen to paper on this theme at this moment.
Yeah, I think you'd have to be living in a pretty deep hole in the ground not to recognize that there's something seriously wrong going on in the world these days. And we're not, there's the virus, of course, the medical pandemic, but responses to the medical pandemic, and not just in the United States, seem to smack of a certain amount, both of irrationality and a lack of concern for the well-being of others. Then there are the shenanigans around the January 6th event, well over a year ago, surrounding the Biden election. And it was a real election. He was truly elected. And a host of other conspiracy theories. There's still Holocaust deniers among us. And we thought that—
Not among us.
Not right here.
Not right here.
Among us in this world.
Good point. I'm glad you clarified that. We thought that as philosophers, the least we could do, and probably the most we could do, is to write a book that both diagnoses, points to this pandemic of irrationality, which is only exacerbating the effects of the medical pandemic, and come up with a diagnosis of what's going on, and hopefully offer some solutions to what the future might hold in store if somehow we can get back on the track of a rational world.
You do that, and we'll come to it. But first of all, I want to just draw attention to something that's perhaps not instantly obvious from the title, but was obvious from the book and is obvious from what you've said just then, is that by bad thinking, by the way, whichever of you wants to ever jump in on in this conversation, do so, because I don't know which of you might have preferences in these topics and questions. But by bad thinking, it becomes very clear you don't just mean irrational, illogical, disorderly, crazy thinking. You also mean immoral, unethical, harmful thinking. It's a double meaning of bad and good, or both meanings of bad and good in your book. Do you think those two things are linked together, the immorality of bad thinking and the irrationality of bad thinking? One leads to the other.
Yeah, they certainly are linked. One of the examples we discuss is due to a 19th century British mathematician and philosopher named William Clifford. And Clifford has a principle that we should never believe anything without adequate justification for that belief. But he ties it into the moral realm because he points out that our behavior is often based on our reasoning. And so if our reasoning is bad, then the behavior that we're basing that reasoning on could end up immoral. And his example is a ship owner who suspects that the ship he owns is not in good shape, and yet rather than pursuing the justified belief, the belief that he ought to believe rationally that his ship is unsafe, he chooses to ignore the evidence, and the ship is full of passengers, and it sinks. So his bad thinking in this case led to a terrible outcome, and that's why bad thinking will often inject itself into a moral realm.
There are lots of reasons why people fail to do the right thing and do bad things. I mean, I don't doubt that there are malevolent people out there who, when they act badly, know exactly what they're doing and doing exactly what they want. And then there's also the fact that a lot of people are overcome by emotion or passions, and end up acting contrary to their better judgment, their better moral judgment. But it's also the case, as we try to show in the book, that a lot of amoral or immoral behavior, a failure to do the right thing, comes from the fact that people don't really think about what they're doing and don't give enough thought, not just to what it is they're doing, but to the principles and the values that should inform their choices of what to do.
And you think that's blameworthy? I mean, that's a point that you make quite strongly. It's not just something you think, oh, well, some people think badly, some people think, well, but this sort of bad thinking that leads to such consequences is really something you can hold people responsible for morally.
That's true. Yeah. So just to think again about that ship owner, he's certainly blameworthy for the death of the passengers of the ship if he ignored the evidence that the ship was unsafe. And I'm also happy to blame vaccine people who doubt the efficacy of the vaccine. We're finding now in the States, hospitals are full of patients with COVID because they reason poorly about the efficacy of the vaccine, and they're preventing people with other sorts of health concerns from receiving the medical care that they need because there's no space for these people in the hospital. And I think this is a moral shortcoming on their part, and it's due to bad thinking about the efficacy of the vaccine.
It all comes down to whether they should have known better. And that, of course, makes one wonder, could they have known better? And if it's impossible for them to have known better, if it's impossible for them to have enough information behind the nature of their action to really know what the right thing to do was, then we wouldn't hold them morally culpable. What we would try to do is educate or correct them. But if they certainly could have known better, if the information was there, but they simply refused to acknowledge it, or if the information they got came from a source that some amount of investigation would reveal is not a good or reliable source. So if you're listening to Fox News as opposed to medical experts, you should be able to determine which source of information is the more reliable one. And if you fail to even take steps to confirm the quality of your evidence, then we'd say you are blameworthy.
But that's interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of people really do lack the skills of discernment in this respect, either because they weren't trained to think critically, or these days because the pace of social or media change has simply overwhelmed them, and then no longer capable of distinguishing in the way that they might have been able to in the media landscape or the social landscape in which they grew to maturity themselves. They're no longer capable of finding their way through the current landscape. And you prescribe some personal and social remedies for this.
Yeah, we do think that social media bears a good deal of responsibility for the current situation. There's so much more information coming at people from so many directions. It's such a huge informational overload. And it is a challenge to discriminate between reliable sources of information and unreliable ones. Where is it coming from? A partisan source? Do the people have any credentials? But that said, it's not that hard. I mean, it really is not that difficult. Of course, if you limit yourself to only one source of information, you're not even going to attempt to begin to discriminate the quality of the evidence. So the first step is a very easy one, and just that's increase the range of information sources and try to make sure there's some kind of ideological or at least epistemic diversity among those sources.
Yeah, we live in a world where all fields are becoming increasingly specialized, and it's the kind of world, because of that, that we have to know that we have to defer in some cases to experts. We can't know everything, which means we have to figure out how to defer, which experts to trust. There's an example, a recent example. There's a famous quarterback for our local Green Bay Packers team here in Wisconsin named Aaron Rodgers, and Aaron Rodgers made the claim months ago that he was immunized against COVID. But in fact, what he meant by immunized was not the standard term. People took him to mean that he had been vaccinated, but he hadn't been. He had done his own research, he said, and determined that
a terrible phrase.
Yeah, and what it shows, though, is that doing your own research is itself a skill. There's no reason to think that Aaron Rodgers has any skill at all in research. I don't have any skill at all in football, and I wouldn't proclaim how to play football, and he shouldn't pretend to know how to do research.
That's right. And I think there's, by the way, we've got a question or two in, but keep them coming, because the time will come very shortly when we can go to people's questions. As well as not being able necessarily, although you've challenged this assumption, as well as some people not being able necessarily to make accurate determinations between truth and false, and possibly even right and wrong. It might also be the case, that lots of people today are unaware of the ramifications of the decisions and choices that they make. Even the act of voting now feels very personal, and there must be very few people who think, well, in this act of voting, I'm affecting every other of my fellow citizens. This is a problem of democracy that we've had, obviously, for I suppose almost 100 years now. And there are lots of humanists, actually, I was thinking about this as I read your book, lots of humanists in the beginning of the democratic age in the early 20th century who wrote a lot of books. People like Susan Stebbing, who was president of Humanists UK in the early days, wrote a lot of books, sort of not quite panicking, but making it really clear that we really needed in a democratic age to encourage people to think and to teach them how to think. And because no longer did people's private mistakes remain private, they were now full of public ramifications and consequences. But do you think that a lot of people don't understand that? I mean, in vaccination and in COVID time, we've become used to hearing people say, I make my own decisions about the risk that I am willing to bear, sometimes not seeming to understand the consequences of their actions on others. And that's another area of complexity, isn't it, where it's more difficult now than it was perhaps some decades ago to understand the consequences of our actions.
It might be more difficult, although in a way, it's no more or less of a moral challenge. The failure to think through the consequences of your actions, and not to think about how other people's lives and well-being are affected by what you do. There's a failure of moral insight there. It's not anything. It's not a talent or a skill that's any different than it was 200, 300, 500 years ago. What does make it more different, I think, are the ways in which people, as you say, the border between the private and the public seems to have become blurred. If you simply look at the stuff that people are willing to say or post on social media, Twitter and Facebook, this sharing that's going on here, and then people realize, when they see the consequences, not just for others, but for themselves of the things they post, you have to wonder, what are they thinking? The temptation to spill your guts or just to blow something off the top of your mind must be so irresistible that you don't really attend to the fact that you might end up getting fired or lose any kind of public reputation.
It's too easy to speak your mind now these days. Even before the sort of social media that the internet gave us, just think about the transition from writing letters on paper to email. I have found myself regretting emails I sent to someone, and it would never have gotten as far if I had to actually draft a letter and put it in an envelope and put postage on it. By the time I got to the post office, I would have already realized my mistake. Email, unfortunately, requires more discretion, and social media today, it's easier than email. You just insert a comment into a balloon, and thousands of people could read it.
Larry used to play a game he called e-roulette. He would type the email response that he wanted to send to somebody, and then close his eyes and move the mouse and click. And if it happened to hit send, it would hit send.
Oh, that's good. That's a good recipe. I'm glad you didn't include that as a recommendation in the book for a more moral life. That would not have been made for such a reputable read. So in the book, it's a sort of training manual, partly in how to avoid different biases and different traps in our own thinking, and it's very good from that point of view. To anyone listening, I'd recommend. We all need mental spring cleaning, even the most rational and enlightened people, of whom surely we're not among anyway. Wouldn't claim that, but even those people would need regular mental spring cleaning, and of course you have that in abundance here. Different types of thinking described, but also how to be a reasonable person, how to reason and to think clearly. Is there anything that particularly, what lessons have you found have particularly struck chords with your readers or the people that you've talked to about your work?
Well, some of the lessons,
the top tips?
Some of the lessons are somewhat technical. I mean, the early chapters detail a number of fallacies that are common in the way in which people come to make decisions or just reason. And some of them are very familiar fallacies that some might be more familiar only to philosophers. And part of our hope is that simply by illuminating these fallacies or these ways of bad thinking, of drawing conclusions that don't follow from premises, or refusing to see how one's action is not only not required by the rules, but is contrary to the intention behind the rules. These probably are best learned by studying philosophy. Then there are more general recommendations we make about, and these are the sort of the later chapters in the book, and these are lessons that go back to Socrates about how to lead an examined life. And these are not technical lessons, but it simply calls for a bit of reflection and self-examination that as life speeds up, we seem to have less and less time for. Questions you need to ask yourself.
If I could just condense the earlier chapters of the book that Steve alluded to as having a more technical content, two messages can be stated in a very non-technical sort of way. One concerns the confirmation bias, which is this bias people have toward evidence that supports their favored belief. And the way to prevent yourself from falling victim to this bias is to, when you're considering whether to believe something, not ask what supports your belief, but ask whether there's evidence against that belief. And this is the sort of case where a number of years ago, there were some prominent people claiming that vaccines for things like measles, mumps, and rubella cause autism. And all these people would do is look at cases where someone has had this vaccine and then acquired autism. They never looked at cases where people had the vaccine and didn't have autism. So that's an easy example of where confirmation bias leads people wrong. And then the second lesson that's easy to impart, I think, is that the more extraordinary the claim, the more evidence you need to support it. So it's quite an extraordinary claim that the COVID vaccine is ineffective or in fact harmful. It's an extraordinary claim because it flies in the face of 10,000 scientists' investigations and millions of pages of research on this. And so if you're going to try to refute all of that evidence in favor of the value of the vaccine, you're going to need extraordinary evidence to show us why all of that is wrong.
And I think that those looking at biases and fallacies and own thinking is always so valuable, I think, because it is a matter of training, isn't it? Training oneself to constantly, you'll always fall into these traps, and
yes, that's right.
Take a step back.
And there's some wonderful work in psychology by people like Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, his late partner in research, showing that people are psychologically susceptible to certain sorts of biases. And this doesn't mean it's impossible to resist irrationality, just like people have evolved a preference for sweets and fatty foods, but we can still resist these sorts of foods. Likewise, there might be certain inclinations people have toward bad reasoning, but once these examples of bad reasoning are brought to light, I think it's possible to resist them.
And how would you describe to someone the benefits? I mean, it's, you know, people don't resist sugary, fatty foods because they just feel one day that's what they'd like to do. They do so because they think there's a health benefit. You know, it's better for them on some other level not to have the consequences of fatty and sugary foods. How do you describe the benefits of better thinking?
I would think
Steve can take this.
Well, I would think that there's sort of an intrinsic value in being a rational person, that nobody wants to be wrong or hold false views or to be engaged in fallacious thinking. I mean, there are people who, for cynical reasons, will play on the credulity of others by using fallacious reasoning. But I guess I'm a bit of an optimist about human nature, in that
sounds like it. Yes.
That we want our beliefs to be true beliefs. We want to be right. We want to have knowledge. And the more you fall prey to fallacious reasoning, the more you get suckered in by propaganda or cynical politicians, the less likely you are to reach a level of understanding of things. So just as we have tried to avoid being unhealthy in our bodies, so I think we want to try to avoid being unhealthy in our minds.
Do you really believe what I assume you do, but believe what you say there? I mean, we do, don't we? I mean, let's take it as read that the three of us at least want as many of our beliefs as possible to be true. Let's take that as read, and maybe everyone who's listening now. But is that as universally true as you indicate? I mean, I can see that people want the beliefs that are important to them in their day-to-day lives, that are operationally, significant in making their lives work and make sense, to be true. But there are lots of beliefs that people don't care one way or the other if they're true or not, really, don't they? I mean, like the beliefs that they hold in their minds to make themselves feel better, or to fill in the gaps of their knowledge, and they don't really care whether or not there was whether dinosaurs lived at the same time as people. So the thing they think about, X, Y, or Z. I remember a cognitive behavioral therapist once saying to me, the reason why people panic is because they've got this fight or flight instinct, which was fine in the wild when we had to run away from dinosaurs. But and I was thinking, oh God, run away from dinosaurs. That wasn't, a belief that was true, but they didn't really mind, because for them it was a belief to illustrate a general point, and they didn't expect people to care or for it to be particularly significant whether it was in fact true that people lived at the same time as dinosaurs, and therefore whether their precise analogy was accurate. And there's lots of things that people think about that they can almost maintain as well two contrary things in their mind at once. Quite often when they think about different stories or narratives, especially in the past, or in things that just aren't significant to them in the operations of their daily life. Don't you think? Does everyone really care about being right all the time, or their beliefs being true all the time? I'm not sure.
Well, I wouldn't say all the time. And we do recognize, and we say this in the book, that there are very often good reasons to believe something that aren't epistemic reasons. That is, they're not reasons that support the truth of the belief. So, for example, to take the most obvious example, people believe in God. Why? Not because they've had any evidence that God exists, but because it's a comforting belief, and that's fine. Hold on, my battery's about to go.
Oh,
that's fine. It's not our desire to turn people into emotionless, 100% purely rational thinking automatons. And there are a lot of beliefs where it's perfectly acceptable, even beneficial, to have certain beliefs, beliefs about yourself, beliefs about your loved ones,
about the future,
and about the world. There's nothing wrong with that. However, I do think, and this is not really that optimistic a view of human nature, because my view on this stems, let's just say, it stems from an egoistic account of human motivation. Everybody wants to be better off, and that's why we do things. But shouldn't being better off mean not just being better off in terms of wealth or health, but also in terms of your cognitive condition? And so it's in our own best interest, each individual's own best interest, to try to become as good a thinker as possible, again, without dismissing the importance of emotions in our lives and the comfort that some beliefs bring, despite our being unable to confirm them as true.
There are also a number of beliefs that just don't have weighty consequence. So, I might believe that I've got a dozen eggs in the refrigerator. And if I learned that I was wrong, that I had a false belief, I wouldn't really care that much. But on the other hand, if I want to make a decision that would have an impact on my health or on my family's happiness, where these are meaningful consequences to me, then I'll do my best to justify the truth of that belief.
Let's come to some questions now, because we've got a good stock of questions, and one of them links directly to this. So here's someone's question, similar to what we've been discussing. A lot of bad thinkers seem proud of their bad thinking, perhaps because it signifies to them and others they don't belong to the group that believes the lies that the mainstream believes, and they passionately reject methods to improve their thinking and ideas for fear of being swallowed up by the tribe they reject. This is quite an important bias, isn't it? The whole sort of my side, my tribe bias. What do you believe society and individuals can do to make people feel they are part of a whole again, and hopefully encourage them to subscribe to good ideas and consideration for others?
It's an interesting question. And I think we have to use the same medication that's being turned against them, against their own better interests, and try to show them that, in fact, if what they're seeking is a sense of belonging, a sense of contributing to the well-being of a community that cares for them, we need to show them that, in fact, the best way to do that is to become a participant in communal good thinking. I suppose this is what national myths do very well. We create these patriotic stories about the origins of American democracy, or wherever you may happen to live, communities create narratives about themselves. Why should these narratives be grounded in not just myths, because some myths I think are quite useful, but pernicious myths that encourage division among citizens and even violence?
It's unfortunate that the kinds of events that typically bring people together and make them feel as belonging to a single community are tragic events. So in my lifetime, the bombing of the World Trade Center comes to mind as a time in American history, maybe the first time since World War II, that people felt this sort of common sense of urgency and of harm, and but also the silver lining to all this was that Americans really came together. Turns out the mayor of New York, who was the leader of this togetherness, turned out to be a total crank, but that wasn't known. That was an unknown at the time. But what would be nice if it didn't take a tragedy to bring people together. It's too bad that seems to be the unifying force.
So the best thing would be if humanity was attacked by some extraterrestrial aliens, we could all unite and have a moment of...
we've seen that movie in Independence Day, right? The whole world comes together.
And everyone came together. Yeah, that's it. Oh, well,
the worlds. It's
something to hope for pain. Anyway.
Right.
Okay. Now, oh gosh, there's so many here now. Oh, this is a good one, actually. Someone picked up on something you said a moment ago, which perhaps you didn't entirely believe, but you said it off the cuff slightly. Is that they don't agree with you that believing in God is just fine. They beg to differ. To what extent is a belief in an almighty entity a factor in bad thinking? COVID, for example, and there are other examples too.
Well, it's not the belief. Sorry, go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, so I've actually written a book about this, which Andrew mentioned, the miracle myth, and Steve is right that many people who believe in God because of the comfort they find in the belief. I've spoken to people who say to me, "How can you get up in the morning if you don't believe in God?" And the answer is, "Well, I'm hungry and I want a cup of coffee." But the point behind that question is they find a belief in God so central to their lives that they can't imagine a happy life without such a belief.
Mm.
And at the same time, they recognize that they don't have rational evidence for this belief. It's a belief they adhere to because of the good it does for them. But there are a number of other people, and maybe this question has these people in mind, who do insist that their belief in God is a true belief, a justified belief. And this is what my Miracle Myth book is about. These people, I think, just don't understand certain canons of rationality, and try as they might to justify a belief in something supernatural, it can't be done in my view. And so the question that we were considering now, the questioner might take this view that no belief in God is a genuine belief unless it has rational justification behind it, and there isn't any rational justification. But contrary to that is the view Steve was suggesting, where there are other reasons to believe something, reasons that don't require evidence.
Let me also address the question from a practical point of view. I suspect, and the questioner can correct me if I'm wrong, I suspect that part of his concern is the violence and hatred that often comes from religious beliefs. I mean, history is full of tragedy, mass murder, and divisiveness from differing faiths, and certainly would deny that. But I also find myself greatly admiring of certain people of faith. Take, for example, Dorothy Day, the American anarchist and founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, the Berrigan brothers, who have campaigned against nuclear arms and put their lives on the line, all motivated by a deep religious faith. So I don't think that the belief in God per se necessarily has these pernicious consequences, but only when combined in certain ways with other beliefs or failure, sort of a lack of clarity about what it is this belief in God entails.
It seems slightly different to what you were saying earlier about how important it was for all our beliefs to fit into the sort of, yes, we've got good rational justification for this belief. We never want to believe things that we haven't got that for.
No, because didn't I say before that there are a number of beliefs that we might have good reasons for believing, but they're not epistemic reasons.
Yes, I didn't realize this rather significant one would be one of those, but okay.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a person of faith, so I don't know what it's like to believe in God.
No.
Neither do I know what it's like to believe in God and think that belief is epistemically justified.
No, quite. Yeah. Yes. Now, here's a good question. Do you think teaching critical thinking, in particular to children, is valuable? Because this question has seen it suggested that the evidence of effectiveness for this kind of practice is fairly limited. Now, I'm not quite sure the premise of that question is true, because there has been at least an amount of evidence in the UK that I'm personally familiar with that critical thinking, education in critical thinking is extremely valuable, not least in moral development of children. But you will know perhaps more about this. So is it the case that education, formal education in school in critical thinking is actually valuable in the increase of good thinking, as your book wants us to practice?
Absolutely. I mean, there's how could it's
is this evidence from psychology, from studies that have been done?
Well, my I would say my evidence is mostly anecdotal. Watching children grow. And children are naturally philosophical creatures. They're always asking why. They want to know the reasons for things. And they catch you when you engage in bad reasoning, or when you exercise authority that's not justified. So I think there's sort of a natural propensity to philosophy in children, and we kill it by not taking advantage of it and feeding it. We teach them such technical, difficult disciplines, mathematics, science, even at young ages, why aren't we teaching them philosophy? What could be more important to raising good and responsible citizens than to teach them how to tell a good argument from a bad argument, how to discriminate between sources of information, and what counts as a justified belief and an unjustified belief?
It's a good question. I'd like to do some research about whether efforts to teach critical thinking have met with the success that we think it's likely to. I do know that there are a number of outreach efforts that philosophers and philosophy grad students have made to elementary schools, where they will enter these schools and teach these young children basics in critical thinking. And I also do know of data that shows that philosophy majors in colleges end up more successful than people who choose other majors in the workplace. They're regarded as good thinkers, analytic, good at synthesizing data, good communicators. And so in some sense, it might be that people are drawn to philosophy because they already have these dispositions. But I like to think that a philosophical education also makes a difference to people's long-term abilities to digest information and communicate it effectively.
There is a good book by Gary Matthews, who is a philosopher at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, on teaching philosophy to children. And he thinks not only is it possible and desirable, but it can be very effective. Instilling these sorts of habits, thinking habits in children makes a difference.
I mean, I was going to say that the evidence that I'm most familiar with, and I don't know if this movement exists in the same way in the United States, but in the UK at least, of the philosophy for children and philosophy for communities movement, which takes a community of inquiry-led approach. And I remember seeing some action research and other research a few years ago that demonstrated the extreme beneficial effects of that whole approach. So perhaps our questioner could take a look for that, because they even came and did a session actually at one of our conventions sometime in the last 15 years. I can't remember exactly when. And it was extremely illuminating and persuasive. And the people who presented that session on the research made exactly the sort of anecdotal observations in addition to presenting their research that you've both made, which is the way in which you can practically see children in particular develop in front of your eyes as you take this approach. And it's purely a Socratic approach. So, I mean, it's... we think we've got the evidence, questioner, to support these claims. Now, interesting question about how we deal with adults, having dealt with children just now. Most adults have their views formed by their parents, whose views were formed by their parents. How do you break the cycle in the majority of the population? There's a very good quote by one of our old vice presidents. I can't remember what his name was. Maybe you'll be able to tell me if he was famous, or he might not have been famous. But he said, if we're not extremely careful and don't work extremely hard, our children might end up thinking the same things that we do. And that does often happen, I think. How do you break this cycle? Larry, you look like you were ready with an answer.
I like to compare our book and books like it. There are a number of other books now with ideas similar to ours, emphasizing the importance of critical thinking and rational deliberation in our lives. And it is true that many of us have our views formed by our parents, and probably just as importantly, or even more important, by our peer groups. But this doesn't mean that books like ours can't make a difference. And so the comparison I like to make is to books like Peter Singer's Animal Liberation that came out in the 1970s. It was the first real extended defense of vegetarianism. And it didn't make a difference for years, but now you can't walk into a restaurant without seeing vegetarian options. And this is because the anti-meat movement began to grow as authors like Singer and others, as their ideas became promulgated by people who read the books and were impressed by these books. And it's now just sort of commonplace to see vegetarian options everywhere, and it took only a few decades for this transition to occur. And what I think is that the more books that come out of the sort that Steve and I have written, the more attention will be given to the need for rational reflection and rules for rational reasoning. And my hope is that in a couple decades, we'll see people as accepting as commonplace the sorts of lessons on critical thinking that these books are promoting as people today see as commonplace vegetarian thinking in food selection.
Is that your belief as well, Steve?
Yeah, I think the Singer case is a good example. I suppose I'm not much of a good, robust cultural determinist, because I do think that through education we can avoid falling into the rut of simply conforming to the beliefs of our parents. You see it. Education, of course, is the key here, and so many of us who end up going able and fortunate enough to go to college undergo a kind of transformation. The challenge then is to see if that transformational experience can be introduced even among people who aren't as lucky to go to higher education, or again, introducing philosophy or a broader range of humanistic disciplines in secondary education. I mean, how many high schools, I'm just speaking about the United States, it's very rare to find a high school really teaching courses in philosophy and art history, even in classics. Just those kinds of courses. You don't have to be a philosopher to get a good education in how to read a text, how to interpret a cultural product, a work of art, and citizenship. I think here again, I might be overly optimistic again. But.
It's a pretty audacious theory of social change, if I might suggest, that the idea that a philosopher writes a book and then, the entirety of society shifts down the
Karl
decades.
Marx.
Well, yeah, no, that's a good example, and I suppose the Peter Singer one is an example. I'm not familiar enough with the idea that the extent to which the plates might already have been moving in those directions, but it's linked to another question that a questioner has here, saying he suspects that those who read the book already mostly will practice good thinking. How do you think we can reach non-readers of the book to help them think less badly, which I assume is the ultimate aim? And you assume right, questioner, because that is very clear in the book, the ultimate aim. Your book, is it, it's written in a very popular way, I think. I mean, you described the first couple of chapters as being technical. I thought they were extremely accessible and read very well. Presumably, part of the answer to this question is get it into more people's hands. That's what you want to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's something we still wrestle with, because the people most likely to read this book are the people who probably least need it.
Yeah.
But those are the people we rely on, because we all know people who are falling into the trap of bad thinking. Living in Madison, Wisconsin, you don't run across many people who are Trump supporters, but we know they're out there. And if we don't know them, people we know them. And in a way, this book could be, if not a direct way of reaching those people, at least a good tool for encouraging others and showing them how to talk to their family members or friends or coworkers who seem to be falling off the deep end.
These are the same things you would suggest, Larry? I mean, you said a moment, if fill in the gaps a little bit between Singer's book coming out and then the vegetarian menus appearing everywhere. Presumably it was people talking to people and a culture of, accountability for your actions and beliefs arising as a result of those billions of individual interactions. That's what you hope for, I guess.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There are a number of vegetarians around today who've never even heard of Peter Singer, but
most of them probably. Most vegetarians have probably never heard.
Right, exactly. But it could be that Singer and others, Tom Regan, these are people whose influence might, but for their influence, these people may not have been vegetarians. And my hope is that the continuing production of books that stress the importance of rationality in our lives will have this kind of perhaps invisible influence on a future generation.
I suppose there are so many, there are so many forces, as it were, arranged against your aspirations, though.
Yeah.
Whereas, I don't need to follow the vegetarian analogy sort of slavishly, but, in that instance, it's supported by all sorts of other instincts, cultural pressures, greater awareness in the West of Eastern traditions, for example, undoubtedly has contributed to vegetarianism as well. It's not all been Peter Singer's rational, utilitarian approach to animals and so on, other animals. It's been other things too, people's aesthetics and people's other sorts of beliefs. And then against that, you've had, the meat industry, I guess. Whereas against this movement, which is, as I understand it, and in your book is really, you see as the dynamic continuation of the Enlightenment tradition. There are many different forces ranged against it, nationalistic forces of tribalism that we're used to, religious fundamentalist forces, in fact, as well, political forces, people whose economic interest it is strongly in to prevent people from reasoning properly and thinking about the consequences not only of their actions, but of the actions of other people who are blameworthy for the way that they fail to reason properly or reason morally. It's pretty daunting in a different way.
It's hard to keep your chin up, I think. Especially in light of recent events. You would think that people who still think the American election was stolen from Donald Trump at a certain point would have to concede in the face of overwhelming evidence that it's wrong. But no, there's probably, as far as I can tell, been no diminishing in the number and passion of people who continue to think that Biden's election was illegitimate. And then you see people whose loved ones are dying in hospitals from the COVID, but still believe that the vaccine is a plot by the Democratic Party hatched in a pizza joint, along with the sex trafficking that's going on there. It's really hard to stay optimistic. And to be honest, a lot of us in this country are deeply scared about the upcoming elections, midterm elections, and the elections of 2024, because there seems to have been no real epistemic correction in what people believe about what happened in 2020.
Here's a question about this. How do you actually get someone who watches Fox News to watch and read other sources of real information, given that they see it as fake news anyway? You're in a conversation with them. Yeah. You can't kidnap them. That's not right. So, what do you do when you I assume you've got neighbors or colleagues, maybe not colleagues, neighbors, family members, friends.
When I have a relative who's a conspiracy theorist, and when we have conversations about all manner of things she believes, I invite her to show me her sources, and I ask her to read my sources, and we have a conversation about this. So far, I have not been able to convince her that she's wrong about things, but I have been able to convince her that particular sources she's shown me are wrong. So that's one place to start, I think. Another thing to do is because social media and the internet generally is such a dangerous source of misinformation, there are a number of people working on websites that evaluate the veracity of a source. So there's a man named Mike Caulfield who's developed something with the acronym CRAP, CRAAP, which is a online device for evaluating the truthfulness of a source. And
I'm Googling crap right now.
Yeah.
Oh, we're always Googling crap.
Yeah. But my hope is more people like Caulfield and more tests like crap will become available, and people will start seeing the value of these things.
I found, and this in a way is similar to what Larry was suggesting, that when you are actually having a face-to-face conversation with a person who is just spouting falsehoods, obvious falsehoods, whether they're political or moral, whatever it may be, the best strategy is simply to say to them, well, why do you believe that? Rather than pushing back and saying, no, that's wrong, or giving them your point of view, simply ask them, why do you believe that? And they'll respond with something. And then usually the next step is to say, well, why do you believe that? And hopefully the result is you get them to reflect on not just what they believe, but the justification or evidence for their belief. You get them to ask questions about really, why am I believing this? That seems to be the most generous and personal way to go about trying to get people to think about what they're thinking.
It's the most dignified one as well.
Yeah. Let them decide.
You could also, just returning to points I was making about the confirmation bias a little while ago, it's often valuable to ask someone what evidence they would accept as defeating their belief. And if there's nothing at all that can be shown to them that would cause them to doubt their beliefs, then that in itself is a reason to dismiss the belief. It's something that's trivial if it can't be shown to be false.
Question that takes us from the political right back to the personal again. Are there good methods of probing our own minds to see if we hold any cognitive dissonances? What do you prescribe for this? Do you prescribe sitting down once a week and thinking, how am I doing this week? What crazy beliefs have I had? Or is it more in the moment, or is it more training yourself in disciplines or cultivating a virtue? How do you do this?
I think reading widely and having conversations with people with alternative viewpoints is a very good recipe for honest evaluation of your own beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
But I also agree with what Andrew was suggesting, that every once in a while, stop and ask yourself, take stock of what you believe and ask, why do you believe it? I always start my introduction to philosophy class by having the students read Plato's dialogue titled Euthyphro.
Oh yes, a class. Yeah,
we had to do that. It's great. It's short, and they see, and of course it's a dialogue, so it's really Socrates getting Euthyphro to come to the realization that he doesn't really know what he thinks he knows. But there's no reason why that sort of exercise has to be between two people. You can do it for yourself. Ask yourself, what do I know? What do I believe? And why do I believe it?
I do that, actually. I think that is worth doing. I think it's something to, maybe that's because I was forced to read Euthyphro as well. Everyone here and on YouTube afterwards, read Euthyphro. It's painful at the time, but it'll do you good. Okay. To what extent would you say the epidemic of bad thinking is due to changes in public attitudes, and to what extent to wider ranges of existing views being now expressed, for example, via social media platforms? This is a very interesting question, because there's been a lot of discussion in the UK, for example, the extent to which racism, in particular, suddenly a lot more racism is publicly visible. Is that because it's having a resurgence, or is it because suddenly the people who kept quiet for 30 years while a social change was going on around them are now thinking, well, I'm going to say it anonymously online, or not so anonymously online? It becomes more socially respectable when they were keeping it to themselves previously, just as one example. What do you think? Is it that things are getting worse or getting more visible?
I think it's a bit of both. Your point about visibility, I think, is a good one, that you can't help but come across a lot of what we confront each day in terms of information. I'm still, I wouldn't call myself a Luddite, but I still like getting my news from the daily hard copy of a newspaper because it's finite and I control it in a certain way. Whereas reading it online with links and links to links, it becomes an infinite task. But I do think it's partly the visibility of the information and the ease with which it comes at us. But I think there's also an element of passivity now, and related to the ease with which the information comes, that we're no longer active consumers of information. We are passive receptors. And it doesn't afford us the opportunity to be critical. Perhaps in a previous era, if you wanted to learn about something, you actually had to go out and do your homework. You had to research it, and that involved reading or seeking out authorities or experts. Now you don't have to leave your kitchen.
Mm.
There's also a wider and stronger reach by duplicitous people who make a living on spreading misinformation. You know, the Tucker Carlsons and Rush Limbaughs of the world who have a much larger mouthpiece than what would have been the case 20 years ago.
An interesting question now, harking back to a theme we discussed earlier. I think this might have to be at least the penultimate question, if not the final one, depending on how long it takes to deal with it. Holding each other accountable for bad thinking is a tough ask. One advantage of some traditions, faith traditions and churches, is being part of a community where mutual accountability is part of a sort of social contract. What's a humanist equivalent of such a community? I suppose a political community can be an equivalent, can't it? I mean, we started this conversation by talking about democracy. We could see ourselves as fellow citizens with each other and see ourselves as having a contract with each other in that vein. But are there other frameworks within which we can be encouraged to hold each other accountable?
I think the social contract is a good model. You don't have to be a Hobbesian and to believe that it's the only way to avoid a life that's nasty, brutish, and short. But think of the social contract as a kind of moral contract or moral agreement among ourselves. We have to live together. And part of living together means we're going to have to come to some agreement as to what kind of information we're going to allow to govern our decisions, how we're going to make our laws, how we're going to respect each other's rights and well-being, how we're going to actually foster each other's well-being. I kind of like the idea of thinking of that as a tacit contractual model. Let me ask you, though, and your listeners, Brexit, is that an instance of bad thinking?
And we've run out of time. It's just the clock has just ticked onto 10
what
p.m.
happened there?
Time, which is the end of our evening. So, although your question could indeed in other circumstances be a fruitful one, and there are many questions left in the box here to answer, we are going to have to end it there. Thank you again for staying up with your cocoa, which will be empty. Your cocoa mug will be empty now. Go restock it, enjoy your evening, and thank you very much again to Steve and Larry for making it a pleasurable one. Good night.
Thanks very much. It was our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fun.